January 21st, 1968. A Marine Corps sentry at Khe Sanh Combat Base peered into the pre-dawn darkness, scanning the hills that surrounded this isolated fire base in northwestern South Vietnam. The night had been quiet, almost too quiet. Then, at exactly 5:30 a.m., the world exploded. The first incoming artillery round screamed overhead and detonated near the main ammunition dump. Then another, and another. Within seconds, dozens of shells were crashing down across the base. The largest stockpile of ammunition and fuel in the region erupted in a massive fireball that lit up the sky like a second sun. Explosions rippled across the compound as artillery shells, mortar rounds, rockets, and fuel drums cooked off in a chain reaction that would last for 48 hours. The siege of Khe Sanh had begun. For the next 77 days, 6,000 United States Marines and their South Vietnamese allies would endure one of the most intensive artillery bombardments in military history. They would face between 20,000 and 40,000 North Vietnamese army troops who surrounded them on all sides. They would live underground like moles, eat cold rations, and wonder every single day if this would be the day the human wave attacks finally came. They would fight what President Lyndon Johnson feared could become America's Dien, the catastrophic defeat that drove the French from Indochina 14 years earlier. This is the story of the siege of Khe Sanh, the 77-day artillery duel that transfixed a nation, tested the limits of American firepower, and became one of the most controversial battles of the entire Vietnam War. It's a story of courage under fire, of innovation in the face of overwhelming odds, and of a siege that to this day historians debate. Was it a crucial American victory, a pointless waste of lives, or the greatest diversion in military history? Let's go back to that remote combat base in the highlands of Quang Tri Province and understand why this place mattered so much, what really happened during those 77 days, and what it all meant for the course of the Vietnam War. To understand Khe Sanh, you first need to understand where it was and why anyone cared about this god-forsaken piece of real estate in the middle of nowhere. Khe Sanh Combat Base sat on a plateau in the northwestern corner of South Vietnam, less than 10 miles from the Laotian border and about 20 miles south of the demilitarized zone that separated North and South Vietnam. It was high ground, sitting at about 1,500 feet elevation, surrounded by even higher ridgelines and mountains covered in triple canopy jungle. The weather at Khe Sanh was miserable for much of the year. During the northeast monsoon season from October through March, the base was often socked in with fog and low clouds that could persist for days. Visibility would drop to zero, helicopters couldn't fly, fixed-wing aircraft had to rely on instruments and radar to even find the place, let alone land or drop supplies. The red clay soil turned into thick, sticky mud that clung to everything. When it wasn't raining, it was usually just overcast and damp and cold, at least by Vietnamese standards. So, why was anyone there? The answer lies in the strategic situation along the border. Route 9, the main east-west road connecting the coast to Laos, ran right through Khe Sanh. The North Vietnamese used this area as a major infiltration corridor, moving troops and supplies from North Vietnam through Laos on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and then into South Vietnam. By holding Khe Sanh, the Americans could monitor and interdict this infiltration, call in airstrikes on enemy movements, and serve as a base for special operations into Laos. There was also a more ambitious strategic vision. Some American planners wanted to use Khe Sanh as a jumping-off point for an invasion of Laos to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail at its source. If you could establish a strong presence at Khe Sanh, then drive west along Route 9 into Laos, you might be able to physically block the main enemy supply line. This was called the McNamara Line concept, named after Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and it involved creating a barrier of strong points, electronic sensors, minefields, and air power across the infiltration routes. Khe Sanh was a key piece of this larger vision. The Marines had maintained a presence at Khe Sanh since 1966, but it was initially just a small camp. In 1967, as enemy activity in the region increased, the base was significantly expanded and reinforced. By January 1968, Khe Sanh had grown into a major combat base, really a small city by military standards. It had an airstrip capable of handling C-130 Hercules cargo planes. It had extensive bunker systems, trenches, barbed wire, and minefields. It had artillery batteries, mortar pits, communications facilities, supply depots, and living quarters for thousands of troops. The base itself was roughly rectangular, maybe a mile long and half a mile wide. The airstrip ran east to west through the middle of the base. On the north side were the living areas, command posts, medical facilities, and various support units. On the south side were more tactical units, artillery positions, and supply areas. The whole thing was surrounded by multiple layers of defensive wire, trenches, and fighting positions. It looked formidable on paper, but it had one critical weakness. It was surrounded by high ground on almost every side. About 3 miles northwest of the main base was Hill 8281 South, one of several key hilltop positions that the Marines occupied to provide early warning and prevent the enemy from placing artillery observers where they could see into the base. Hill 8081 South was connected by ridgeline to Hill 881 North, which was even higher. To the west were more hills, including Hill 861 and Hill 558. These outposts were essentially small fortresses, each held by a company or reinforced company of Marines living in bunkers and trenches carved into the hilltops. The Marines manning these positions were mostly very young, 19 or 20 years old on average. They came from all over America, farm boys from the Midwest, city kids from New York and Los Angeles, Southern boys, and everything in between. Most were volunteers or draftees serving their first combat tour. Their officers and senior NCOs were often Korea veterans or had multiple Vietnam tours under their belts, but the bulk of the force was young men experiencing war for the first time. Life at Khe Sanh before the siege was difficult but manageable. Marines pulled perimeter watch, conducted patrols into the surrounding jungle, improved their defensive positions, and tried to stay ready for whatever might come. The weather was often lousy. The mud was omnipresent. Mail from home was irregular. Hot meals were rare on the hilltop outposts. But there was a routine, a sense of normalcy within the abnormal world of a combat zone. The North Vietnamese Army, or NVA, had been active in the region around Khe Sanh for years, but intelligence suggested a major buildup was underway in late 1967. Reconnaissance patrols made contact with increasingly large enemy formations. Sensors along the Ho Chi Minh Trail detected massive truck traffic moving south. Radio intercepts picked up communications from multiple NVA divisions in the area. Something big was coming. The enemy forces massing around Khe Sanh were some of the best units in the North Vietnamese military. The 304th Division, veterans who had fought the French at Dien Bien Phu, were identified in the area. So were elements of the 325C Division and the 324B Division. These weren't guerrilla forces or local Viet Cong. These were regular Army divisions with artillery, anti-aircraft weapons, engineers, and all the supporting elements of modern military formations. Estimates of total enemy strength varied, but most intelligence assessments put the number somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 troops. Why were the North Vietnamese concentrating so much force around Khe Sanh? This question would be debated throughout the siege and for decades afterward. The most obvious explanation was that they intended to overrun the base, inflicting a humiliating defeat on American forces and recreating their famous victory over the French at Dien Bien Phu. The parallels were obvious: isolated fire base, surrounded by enemy forces, dependent on air supply, far from reinforcement. General Vo Nguyen Giap, who had commanded at Dien Bien Phu, was now the North Vietnamese defense minister. Was he planning to repeat his greatest triumph? But there was another theory, one that gained credence as the siege progressed. Maybe Khe Sanh was a diversion, a way to fix American attention and resources in a remote corner of South Vietnam while the communists prepared for something else. That something else turned out to be the Tet Offensive, the massive coordinated series of attacks on cities and bases throughout South Vietnam that began at the end of January 1968. By threatening Khe Sanh, the North Vietnamese drew American forces to the border regions, away from the cities where the real blow would fall. Whether this was the plan all along, or whether the communists adapted their strategy as circumstances changed, remains unclear. Probably both objectives were in play: win at Khe Sanh if possible, but at minimum, tie down American forces and dominate the world's attention. President Johnson certainly took the threat to Khe Sanh seriously. He became obsessed with the siege, fearing the political and military consequences if the base fell. He had a scale model of Khe Sanh set up in the White House Situation Room and received daily briefings on the tactical situation. He demanded assurances from the Joint Chiefs of Staff that Khe Sanh could and would be held. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs had to provide written certification that Khe Sanh would not fall, essentially staking his professional reputation on the outcome. This presidential attention put enormous pressure on the military chain of command. General William Westmoreland, commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, was determined to hold Khe Sanh. He saw it as both a strategic necessity and a test of American will. He committed massive air power to the base's defense and developed plans for potential relief operations if ground reinforcement became necessary. Below Westmoreland, the Marine commanders responsible for the tactical defense had to turn presidential and theater-level strategic concerns into practical plans that would keep their Marines alive. The Marine commander at Khe Sanh was Colonel David Lowndes, a career officer who had previously commanded a battalion in combat. Lowndes was a professional, competent, and unflappable, the kind of officer Marines trusted. He had about 6,000 Marines under his command at the start of the siege, organized into 3 infantry battalions plus supporting units at the main base, with additional companies holding the hilltop outposts. He also had a battalion of South Vietnamese Rangers and some Special Forces troops at the base. His mission was simple to state, but incredibly difficult to execute: hold Khe Sanh against whatever the enemy threw at him. Lowndes and his staff had been preparing for a major attack since late 1967. Defensive positions were improved. Artillery registration was completed on likely enemy assembly areas and approach routes. Supply stockpiles were built up. Plans were made for defending against ground assault, for dealing with casualties, for maintaining the airstrip under fire. But no amount of preparation could truly ready anyone for what was about to happen. The morning of January 21st started the siege, with devastating effect. That first artillery barrage caught the Marines during shift change, when some were getting up and others were going to sleep, when people were moving around rather than in bunkers. The ammunition dump explosion was catastrophic, destroying approximately 1,500 tons of ammunition. That represented weeks of supply buildup gone in minutes. The fireball was visible from miles away, and the explosions continued for 2 days as rounds cooked off in the intense heat. The initial barrage killed several Marines and wounded dozens more. It destroyed helicopters on the ground, damaged the airstrip, and wrecked several buildings. But more important than the physical damage was the psychological impact. The enemy had the range, they had the firepower. They could hit the base whenever they wanted. From that moment on, every Marine at Khe Sanh knew they were in for a long, difficult fight. The NVA artillery around Khe Sanh was formidable. The Communists had moved heavy weapons into the hills, including 130 mm and 152 mm artillery pieces, 120 mm and 82 mm mortars, and 122 mm rockets. These weren't light guerrilla weapons. These were proper field artillery pieces capable of reaching any point on the base and its outposts. The 130 mm guns in particular had a range of about 17 miles and could fire a shell weighing 73 pounds. They were Soviet-designed weapons supplied to North Vietnam as part of the Communist bloc's support for the war. The enemy had dug these guns into caves and reinforced positions on the north side of the DMZ and in the mountains around Khe Sanh. They would roll the guns out, fire a few rounds, and then pull them back into the caves before American counter-battery fire could arrive. This shoot-and-scoot tactic made it very difficult to destroy the enemy artillery. American fire direction centers would locate the source of incoming fire, compute a fire mission, and send rounds back. But by the time American shells arrived, the enemy guns were already safe in their caves. The North Vietnamese also had excellent camouflage and deception. They built dummy positions to draw American fire. They moved at night. They used the weather to their advantage, knowing that during foggy or rainy periods, American aircraft couldn't spot or strike their positions. They had developed a sophisticated logistics system to keep their artillery supplied with ammunition, despite being under constant American air attack. Against this enemy artillery threat, the Marines at Khe Sanh had their own formidable fire support. At the main base, they They had batteries of 105mm and 155mm howitzers. These medium artillery pieces could reach most of the surrounding terrain and were the backbone of the defensive fires. The 105mm howitzer was the workhorse of Marine artillery, a proven weapon that could fire various types of ammunition, high explosive, illumination, white phosphorus, and more. Each gun crew could maintain a sustained fire rate of about 3 rounds per minute when needed, though obviously that couldn't be kept up indefinitely. The 155mm howitzers were heavier and could shoot farther and hit harder. They required larger crews and more ammunition, but they brought serious firepower to bear. Both types of artillery were positioned in revetments, protective earthen walls that provided some shelter from incoming fire. The gun crews worked around the clock, sleeping in shifts near their guns, ready to fire at a moment's notice. On the hilltop outposts, the Marines had smaller weapons, primarily 81mm mortars and 106mm recoilless rifles. The mortars were invaluable for defending the hills. They could drop rounds on enemy troops advancing up the slopes or hit targets in the valleys that were masked from the base's direct fire artillery. The recoilless rifles were direct fire weapons, essentially giant rifles that could punch through bunkers or hit point targets. Both weapons were man-portable, which was crucial since everything had to be helicoptered to the hilltops. But the real ace in the hole for Khe Sanh's defense wasn't on the ground at all. It was in the air. The amount of air power devoted to supporting Khe Sanh during the siege was unprecedented in warfare up to that time. On average, dozens of aircraft were over or near Khe Sanh at any given moment during daylight hours, and even at night, planes were on station. This included everything from small observation planes to the biggest bombers in the American arsenal. The air campaign around Khe Sanh had a code name, Operation Niagara. The name was chosen deliberately to evoke the image of an unstoppable torrent of firepower cascading down on the enemy. The operation was divided into 2 phases. Niagara 1 was the intelligence collection and target development phase, and Niagara 2 was the actual airstrikes. Both ran continuously throughout the siege. Niagara 1 employed every intelligence-gathering asset available. Photo reconnaissance planes flew missions over the surrounding area, taking thousands of pictures that analysts pored over looking for signs of enemy positions, troop concentrations, supply dumps, and artillery sites. Electronic sensors, small devices that could detect seismic vibrations or acoustic signatures, were scattered along enemy approach routes and around suspected base areas. These sensors would transmit signals when they detected movement, helping to build a picture of enemy activity. Forward air controllers, flying in small observation planes like the O-1 Bird Dog or the OV-10 Bronco, spent hours each day over the battlefield, looking for targets of opportunity and directing airstrikes. These FACs were often the most important people in the air support chain because they could see the terrain, understand the tactical situation, and talk directly to both the guys on the ground and the strike aircraft coming in. A good FAC could make the difference between an airstrike that devastated the enemy and one that accomplished nothing. When targets were identified, Niagara 2 delivered the firepower. Strike aircraft ranged from Marine Corps A-4 Skyhawks and F-4 Phantoms flying from Da Nang and other coastal bases, to Air Force F-4s, F-100 Super Sabres, and A-1 Sky Raiders. The Sky Raiders were propeller-driven attack planes, slow and obsolete by jet-age standards, but beloved by ground troops because they could loiter for hours, carry huge bomb loads, and deliver ordnance with precision. The Air Force also brought in its heavy bombers, B-52 Stratofortresses, the same planes designed to deliver nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union, flew arc light missions around Khe Sanh. Each B-52 could carry dozens of 500-pound or 750-pound bombs. They would fly at high altitude, invisible and inaudible from the ground, and then release their entire bomb load in a pattern that would obliterate everything in a rectangular area called a box. The bombs would fall for almost a minute before impact, and when they hit, the earth itself seemed to heave and buckle. Trees would be stripped, bunkers collapsed, and anyone caught in the box would almost certainly die. The Marines on the ground learned to love the sound of B-52 strikes, even though they couldn't hear the planes themselves. First would come a distant rumble, like thunder, but continuous and growing. Then the ground would shake as hundreds of bombs detonated across the target area. Dirt and debris would fountain into the air. The noise would be physically painful even miles away. After the strike, there would be a brief period of silence, as if the world itself was stunned by the violence, and then the normal sounds of the battlefield would gradually return. During the 77 days of the siege, thousands of tactical airstrikes were flown, and over 2,000 B-52 Arc-Light missions were conducted in the area around Khe Sanh. This was more air power concentrated on a single battlefield than at any time in history up to that point. The tonnage of bombs dropped exceeded what was dropped on Japan in all of World War II. It was firepower on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. But all this air power came with limitations. Weather was the biggest problem. When Khe Sanh was socked in with fog and clouds, which happened frequently, even the most sophisticated aircraft couldn't deliver ordnance accurately. They could drop bombs based on radar or instrument guidance, but precision was impossible. The enemy knew this and often conducted their operations during bad weather periods when American air superiority was negated. Another limitation was the danger to friendly forces. With Marines holding positions sometimes only hundreds of meters from enemy lines, the margin for error in airstrikes was minimal. There were instances of friendly fire incidents where bombs or napalm fell on Marine positions, causing casualties. These were relatively rare given the number of sorties flown, but each incident was tragic and undermined confidence in air support. Procedures were constantly refined to minimize this risk, but the danger could never be eliminated entirely. Despite these limitations, the air support at Khe Sanh was devastatingly effective against enemy forces in the open or in poorly protected positions. North Vietnamese troops trying to move supplies forward, assemble for attacks, or occupy positions in the open were vulnerable to airstrikes. The Communists adapted by moving at night, by using deep bunkers and tunnels, by dispersing their forces, but they paid a heavy price in casualties for their siege of Khe Sanh. Life for the Marines at Khe Sanh during the siege was a special kind of hell. The constant artillery and rocket attacks meant you were never truly safe. The enemy could and did fire at any hour of day or night. Sometimes it was harassing fire, a few rounds just to keep everyone on edge. Other times it was a sustained barrage, dozens or hundreds of rounds crashing down across the base. You learned to distinguish the different types of incoming by their sound. Artillery shells made a distinctive whistling shriek. Rockets made a whooshing noise. Mortars had a characteristic pop when they were fired that sometimes could be heard before the rounds landed. When incoming was detected, sirens would wail, and whoever had the radio watch would broadcast incoming, incoming, incoming over the base's communication system. Marines would dive for the nearest bunker, hole, or any cover available. If you were caught in the open when the rounds started landing, your best bet was to hit the deck and make yourself as small as possible. Pray that nothing landed close, and then run for cover between salvos. The bunkers at Khe Sanh varied in quality. Some were well built, reinforced structures with multiple layers of sandbags and timber, capable of withstanding anything short of a direct hit. Others were hasty constructions that might stop shrapnel, but wouldn't survive a close explosion. Every Marine became an amateur engineer, constantly improving his position, adding more sandbags, more overhead cover, more anything that might improve his odds of survival. Living underground like this took a psychological toll. The bunkers were dark, damp, and claustrophobic. They smelled of earth, sandbags, sweat, and whatever else accumulated in a space occupied by young men with limited hygiene facilities. Rats were a constant problem, attracted by food scraps and the general squalor. Sleep was difficult, interrupted by incoming fire and the constant need for someone to be on watch. When you did sleep, it was fitful, always with an ear open for the sound of sirens or the whistle of incoming. Food at Khe Sanh was mostly sea rations, the canned combat meals that American troops had been eating since World War II. Each meal came in a small cardboard box with various cans. A main course like ham and lima beans or spaghetti and meatballs, crackers, cheese or peanut butter, candy, cigarettes, and various accessories like instant coffee and toilet paper. The meals were nutritionally adequate, but monumentally boring. After weeks of sea rations, everything tasted like cardboard and tin. Hot food was rare. Cooking fires drew enemy fire as the smoke gave away positions. Most Marines ate their sea rations cold, straight from the can. Some would heat them using small chunks of C4 plastic explosive, which burned hot and clean. But this was officially forbidden because C4 was supposed to be used for demolitions, not cooking. The guys did it anyway. A hot meal, even a hot can of beans, was a small comfort in a miserable existence. Water was rationed because everything had to be flown in. Each Marine was supposed to get a couple of canteens per day, but during peak fighting or bad weather, when resupply was difficult, water could be scarce. You used it for drinking first, and if there was any left over, maybe you could spare some for washing. Many Marines went weeks without a proper shower or bath. They wore the same clothes day after day until the uniforms were stiff with dirt and sweat. Personal hygiene was a luxury that often couldn't be afforded. The red clay mud at Khe Sanh was legendary. It clung to everything: boots, weapons, equipment, skin. When it dried, it hardened into something like concrete. When it was wet, which was most of the time during the monsoon season, it was slippery and clinging, making movement difficult and exhausting. Trenches and fighting positions would fill with water and mud, and keeping them drained was a constant battle. Weapons required constant cleaning because the mud would foul the mechanisms. If your rifle jammed in a firefight because you hadn't cleaned out the mud, you could die. Mail from home was incredibly important for morale. Letters from family, friends, and girlfriends provided a connection to the world outside Khe Sanh, a reminder that there was still a normal life somewhere beyond the wire and the bunkers. The mail didn't always get through reliably. Planes carrying mail might get diverted due to weather or emergency resupply missions. When the mail did arrive, its distribution was a major event. Marines would gather around, hoping their name would be called, and the joy on a guy's face when he got a letter was palpable. Some Marines also received care packages from home: cookies, candy, magazines, toiletries, or other small comforts. These were treasured and often shared with buddies. A package of cookies from home might get divided among an entire squad, everyone savoring a small taste of normal civilian life. These small gestures from family members thousands of miles away helped sustain morale in ways that official military support never could. But no amount of mail or packages could fully compensate for the stress of living under siege. The constant danger, the lack of sleep, the poor living conditions, the separation from home, and the knowledge that today or tomorrow might bring a ground assault that could overrun the base all combined to create enormous psychological pressure. Most Marines held up remarkably well, testament to their training, their youth, and the bonds they formed with their fellow Marines. But everyone had limits, and some men reached theirs. Combat fatigue, shell shock, what we now call PTSD, manifested in various ways. Some men became withdrawn and uncommunicative. Others became jumpy and hypervigilant, overreacting to every sound. A few simply broke down, unable to function, and had to be evacuated for psychiatric care. The military didn't understand mental health the way we do now, and there was stigma attached to admitting psychological problems. Most Marines suffered in silence, supported by their buddies, self-medicating with cigarettes and whatever else was available, and just tried to make it through each day. Leadership was crucial in maintaining morale and combat effectiveness. Good NCOs and officers made an enormous difference. They led by example, sharing the same dangers and hardships as their men. They maintained discipline and standards even in the worst conditions. They looked after their Marines, making sure everyone had whatever food, water, and ammunition was available. They settled disputes, prevented panic, and embodied the Marine Corps values that held the unit together. Colonel Lowndes, the base commander, was generally respected by his Marines. He was visible around the base when possible, talking to the troops, checking on positions, and projecting confidence that they would hold. He had to balance multiple competing demands: maintaining the defense, managing limited resources, dealing with higher headquarters, and keeping morale up among thousands of troops under enormous stress. It was a job that would break lesser men, but Lowndes proved equal to the challenge. The hilltop outposts around Khe Sanh had an even harder time than the main base in some ways. They were more exposed, had fewer troops, and were more difficult to resupply. Each hill was essentially a small fortress, with trenches and bunkers dug into the rocky ground, surrounded by wire and mines. The Marines on the hills could see enemy forces moving in the valleys and on adjacent ridgelines. They were often the first to know when attacks were coming because they would see the buildup or receive preparatory fire. Hill 8081 South was one of the most critical positions. It dominated the approaches from the northwest and provided observation over a wide area. The Marines holding it lived in conditions even worse than the main base. Everything had to come up the hill by helicopter, and helicopters drew fire, so resupply was always dangerous and often impossible during bad weather. The hilltop was so rocky that digging proper bunkers was extremely difficult. Marines used sandbags, wood from ammunition crates, and sheets of PSP, perforated steel planking, to build what shelter they could. The outposts were constantly probed by enemy forces. Small patrols or larger reconnaissance elements would probe the wire, test the defenses, try to identify weak points. These probes could turn into serious firefights with heavy casualties on both sides. The Marines on the hills responded with rifle and machine gun fire, mortars, and called artillery and airstrikes from the main base. The noise of combat on the hills could be heard at the main base, and everyone knew that if one of the hills fell, the enemy would have a commanding position that could make the entire base untenable. On the night of February 5th, less than 2 weeks into the siege, the North Vietnamese launched their first major ground assault. The target was Hill 861 Alpha, a small outpost manned by a platoon-sized element. The attack came in the early morning hours, preceded by an intense artillery and mortar barrage. When the barrage lifted, NVA infantry surged forward in human wave attacks, blowing gaps in the wire with Bangalore torpedoes and satchel charges. The fighting was brutal and close range. Marines in their fighting positions fired M16s, threw grenades, and called for artillery fire almost on top of their own position to stop the attackers. Illumination rounds lit up the sky, casting stark shadows and making the battlefield look like something from a nightmare. The noise was deafening: explosions, gunfire, screaming, and the whistling of incoming and outgoing artillery all blending together. The Marines held, but barely. The NVA troops showed tremendous courage, attacking again and again despite heavy casualties. Bodies piled up in the wire. Some enemy soldiers made it into the Marine positions, leading to desperate hand-to-hand fighting. Several Marines were killed, and many more were wounded. Ammunition ran low. At one point, the defenders were down to their last few magazines and grenades. But then, a resupply helicopter braved enemy fire to drop ammunition bundles, and the defense held. When dawn broke and the enemy withdrew, the scene was one of carnage. Dead NVA soldiers lay in and around the wire, some of them within meters of the Marine bunkers. Blood stained the red mud. The Marines had held, and they had inflicted severe casualties on the attackers, but everyone knew this was just the beginning. If the enemy was willing to throw that many troops at a small outpost, what would they do against the main base? The answer came at the end of February when the North Vietnamese launched their most serious ground assault of the entire siege. The target this time was a South Vietnamese Army Ranger Battalion holding positions on the east end of the base. The NVA plan was sophisticated. They used tear gas, something they hadn't employed before, hoping to force the defenders out of their bunkers. They preceded the assault with their usual heavy bombardment, then sent infantry forward supported by tanks. Yes, tanks. Just as at Lang Vây, the North Vietnamese committed armor to the assault on Khe Sanh. Several PT-76 light tanks accompanied the infantry, providing mobile firepower and shock effect. This was a major escalation. Tanks meant the enemy was serious about overrunning the base, not just besieging it. The South Vietnamese Rangers fought bravely, but were hard-pressed. The NVA infantry penetrated the perimeter in several places, overrunning some positions. Tanks breached the wire and began crushing bunkers. For several hours, it looked like the eastern perimeter might collapse, which would give the enemy a foothold inside the main base from which they could roll up the entire defense. Marine reinforcements rushed to the threatened sector. Artillery fire was directed at danger close range. Aircraft, despite marginal weather, made repeated strikes on enemy forces in and around the perimeter. Anti-tank weapons, laws, and 106mm recoilless rifles engaged the enemy armor. It was chaos, with friend and foe intermixed, ammunition expenditure at maximum rates, and the outcome uncertain for hours. By late morning, the attack had been repulsed. The South Vietnamese Rangers had held their positions, though just barely, and with heavy losses. Several enemy tanks had been destroyed or disabled. The bodies of hundreds of NVA soldiers lay around the perimeter. The Marines counterattacked to restore the original defensive line, clearing out any enemy soldiers still inside the wire. The February attack proved several things. First, the North Vietnamese were indeed willing and able to launch major ground assaults. Second, they had armor and weren't afraid to use it. Third, the defenders could hold if they maintained discipline and used their advantages and firepower effectively. But fourth, and perhaps most ominously, the NVA showed they were willing to accept staggering casualties to achieve their objectives. If they were prepared to lose hundreds or thousands of soldiers, they might eventually overwhelm the defense through sheer attrition. This realization led to increased urgency in planning for the defense and potential relief of Khe Sanh. General Westmoreland had already begun developing contingency plans for a ground relief operation if it became necessary. These plans involved sending a large force up Route 9 from the coast, fighting their way through whatever enemy forces were between them and Khe Sanh, and opening a ground supply line. The operation would be difficult and costly, but if the base was on the verge of being overrun, it would have to be attempted. The Marines and the Army argued over who would conduct the relief operation if needed. The Marines wanted to take care of their own, but the Army had more armored and mechanized forces available. Eventually, it was decided that a combined force would be used if necessary, but everyone hoped it wouldn't come to that. The ideal outcome was to hold Khe Sanh with existing forces, supported by air power, until the enemy gave up and withdrew. Meanwhile, the daily routine of the siege continued. Every day brought incoming fire. Some days it was relatively light, 100 or 200 rounds. Other days it was intense, with thousands of rounds impacting across the base and the hilltop outposts. The Marines learned to gauge the seriousness of an attack by the volume and pattern of fire. A few rounds hitting random locations was just harassment. A sustained barrage concentrating on one sector meant something was coming. Casualties mounted steadily. Men were killed or wounded by artillery, by small arms fire during ground attacks or patrols, by accidents, by disease, or by the countless other ways that combat environments claim lives. Each casualty had to be evacuated if possible, which meant getting them to the aid station, stabilizing them, and then loading them on a medevac helicopter or fixed-wing aircraft for transport to a surgical facility. The aid station at Khe Sanh was staffed by Navy medical personnel, as was standard for Marine Corps units. Navy corpsmen and doctors worked around the clock, treating everything from minor shrapnel wounds to catastrophic injuries. The facilities were primitive by civilian hospital standards, essentially bunkers with medical equipment. Doctors performed surgeries by flashlight during power outages, using whatever supplies were available, improvising when necessary. The courage and skill of these medical personnel saved countless lives. But not everyone could be saved. Men died on the operating table despite the best efforts of the doctors. Others died before they could even reach the aid station, bleeding out in their fighting positions or in the trenches. The dead were placed in body bags and stored in a makeshift morgue, really just another bunker, until they could be transported out for burial. In the hot and humid climate, despite the cool temperatures during monsoon season, this was a grim and difficult task. One of the most dangerous jobs at Khe Sanh was working on the airstrip. Aircraft brought in supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements, and took out wounded and dead. But the airstrip was under constant threat from enemy fire. Landing aircraft were vulnerable targets, slow and unable to maneuver while on the ground. The NVA had spotters with eyes on the runway, and whenever a plane landed, they would call for fire. The result was that every landing and takeoff at Khe Sanh was a high-speed, high-risk evolution. Transport planes, primarily C-130 Hercules and smaller C-123 providers, would approach low and fast. They would touch down and immediately cut to the offload point, using the shortest possible ground time. The ramp would drop, cargo and passengers would scramble off or be pushed out, and the plane would immediately power up and take off, often before the ramp was fully closed. The entire process might take less than 3 minutes. Even this wasn't always safe. Several aircraft were hit by enemy. Fire while on the ground. Some were damaged and had to limp away trailing smoke. A few were destroyed, their crews killed or wounded. The sight of a burning aircraft on the runway was devastating for morale, a stark reminder that even the link to the outside world was threatened. The Air Force and Marines eventually developed alternative resupply methods to reduce reliance on runway operations. The low-altitude parachute extraction system, known as LAPES, involved flying a C-130 at extremely low altitude, just feet above the ground, and using parachutes to drag pallets of cargo out the back of the aircraft. The pallets would slide out and skid across the ground while the plane flew on. It was dangerous and didn't always work, but it eliminated the need to land. Another technique was the ground proximity extraction system, where the plane would fly low and snag a cable or net on the ground that would pull the cargo out. Various high-altitude parachute drops were also used, with cargo bundled and dropped from altitude, guided by parachutes to land areas within the perimeter. None of these methods was as efficient as conventional runway operations, but they kept supplies flowing when runway landings became too dangerous. Helicopters were also critical for resupply, especially to the hilltop outposts that had no runways. CH-46C Knights and CH-53C Stallions flew hundreds of sorties carrying ammunition, water, food, replacements, and mail out to the hills, and bringing back wounded and dead. Flying helicopters around Khe Sanh was incredibly dangerous. The slow-moving aircraft were vulnerable to ground fire, and several were shot down. Pilots developed tactics to minimize their exposure, approaching from different directions, varying their patterns, and coordinating with artillery and airstrikes to suppress enemy anti-aircraft positions. The helicopter crews showed extraordinary courage. They knew that every mission might be their last, but they kept flying because the guys on the ground depended on them. There are countless stories of helicopter crews landing under fire to pick up wounded, or delivering emergency ammunition when a position was nearly overrun. These aviators, both Marine and Army crews, were an essential part of the Khe Sanh defense and earned the undying respect of the ground troops. Throughout the siege, reconnaissance and intelligence gathering continued. Long-range patrols, usually small teams of Marines or force reconnaissance units, went outside the wire to gather information on enemy dispositions, movements, and intentions. These patrols were extremely dangerous. They operated in enemy-controlled territory, often miles from the base, with no support except what could be provided by radio and air power. A patrol might spend days outside the wire, moving silently through the jungle, observing enemy positions, setting up ambushes, or conducting raids on supply caches. They communicated by radio, often in whispers or using code words to avoid detection. If they made contact with superior enemy forces, their only option was to run and hope they could reach a landing zone for helicopter extraction before being overrun. Some patrols didn't make it back. They were ambushed, surrounded, and wiped out. Others came back with crucial intelligence that helped target airstrikes or artillery fires. The information these patrols gathered was invaluable, but the cost in lives was high. The men who volunteered for these missions were among the bravest of the brave, willingly going into the most dangerous situations because the information they could gather might save the lives of their comrades back at the base. The North Vietnamese weren't just sitting in their positions taking American fire. They were active and aggressive, constantly trying to improve their positions, move supplies forward, and prepare for the next assault. They dug tunnels and trenches closer to the Marine lines, sometimes getting within 100 meters of the wire. They emplaced new artillery positions, registered their fires, and conducted their own reconnaissance of the Marine defenses. Enemy sappers, specialist troops trained in infiltration and demolition, attempted to penetrate the perimeter on several occasions. They would crawl through the wire at night, cutting paths and trying to reach critical positions like the command post, artillery positions, or the airstrip. Sappers were usually armed with satchel charges, explosive devices they would use to destroy bunkers, guns, or aircraft. Stopping them required constant vigilance by the perimeter guards and liberal use of illumination and defensive fires. The Marines employed various defensive measures against infiltration. Trip flares were set up in the wire, devices that would illuminate when triggered by movement. Claymore mines, directional anti-personnel weapons that could be command detonated, were positioned to cover likely approach routes. Listening posts, small teams outside the main perimeter, provided early warning. And on any given night, artillery and mortars would fire pre-planned defensive concentrations, DFCONs, on suspected enemy assembly areas or approach routes just to keep the enemy off balance. Despite all these measures, the NVA occasionally got through. There were instances of enemy soldiers inside the wire, leading to close quarters combat. These sudden encounters in the dark were terrifying. You might be walking between bunkers and suddenly come face to face with an enemy soldier. Both of you would react instantly, weapons firing, and one or both would die. There was no time for thought, only training and instinct. As the siege stretched from days into weeks and then months, the psychological strain on the defenders increased. Every man wondered the same thing. When would the big assault come? The North Vietnamese had tens of thousands of troops around Khe Sanh. They had proven they could launch major attacks. So, why were they holding back? Was it the American air power? Were they waiting for worse weather when air support would be less effective? Were they building up for one final, overwhelming assault? These questions gnawed at everyone. The constant incoming fire and the occasional ground attacks were bad enough. But the anticipation of something worse was its own form of torture. Some Marines almost wished the enemy would just attack and get it over with. The waiting, the constant tension, was exhausting in a way that even combat wasn't. Back in the United States, the siege of Khe Sanh was major news. It dominated television coverage and newspaper headlines. Reporters compared it to Dien Phu, speculation about whether the base would hold. Some reporters were actually at Khe Sanh, living in the bunkers with the Marines, filing reports that brought the reality of the siege into American living rooms. This media attention put additional pressure on military and political leaders to ensure Khe Sanh didn't fall. Public opinion was divided. Some Americans supported the troops and wanted the base held at any cost. Others questioned why the base was even there, arguing that holding a remote fire base wasn't worth American lives. The broader debate about the Vietnam War intensified, with Khe Sanh becoming a symbol used by both supporters and opponents of the war to make their arguments. In late February and early March, even as Khe Sanh continued to hold under siege, the broader strategic situation in Vietnam was shifting. The Tet Offensive, the massive series of attacks on cities across South Vietnam, had been launched at the end of January. While militarily a failure for the Communists, who suffered enormous casualties and failed to hold any of their objectives, Tet was a psychological and political victory. It shattered American public confidence in the war and proved that the enemy was far from defeated, despite years of optimistic pronouncements from military and political leaders. The relationship between Khe Sanh and Tet would be debated for decades. Did the North Vietnamese originally intend Khe Sanh as a genuine attempt to recreate Dien Bien Phu, only to shift to Tet when the opportunity arose? Or was Khe Sanh always meant as a diversion to draw American attention and resources away from the cities? Different historians and participants have different views, and the truth may never be fully known. What is clear is that by late February, the intensity of enemy activity around Khe Sanh began to gradually decrease. The volume of incoming fire remained high, and there were still probes and small attacks, but the major ground assaults that everyone feared didn't materialize. Intelligence suggested some enemy units were being withdrawn from the Khe Sanh area, possibly to reinforce other fronts, or to replace losses suffered during Tet. By early March, planning began for a relief operation, even though the immediate threat to Khe Sanh seemed to be diminishing. The operation was designated Pegasus, and it would involve a large force of Marines and Army troops, including armored and air cavalry units, opening Route 9 from the coast to Khe Sanh. The operation had multiple purposes: relieve the siege, demonstrate American capability to move forces overland through enemy territory, and prevent the perception that Khe Sanh had been abandoned. Operation Pegasus launched on April 1, 1968. A division-sized force, combining the 1st Cavalry Division and Marine units, began moving west along Route 9. The road had been neglected for months and was in terrible condition, damaged by weather and combat. Engineers had to rebuild bridges, clear obstacles, and repair the roadbed as the force advanced. Progress was measured in miles per day rather than miles per hour. The advancing force made contact with enemy rear guards but encountered less resistance than expected. The bulk of the North Vietnamese forces had withdrawn from the immediate area around Khe Sanh, pulling back into Laos or into the mountains. They left behind extensive fortifications, supply caches, and evidence of the siege: shell casings, destroyed equipment, and mass graves. On April 8th, elements of the relief force linked up with Marines from Khe Sanh. The siege was officially over. The Marines who had endured 77 days of artillery bombardment, ground attacks, and constant stress were finally no longer isolated. A supply convoy could reach them by road. Reinforcements were available if needed. The immediate crisis had passed. The relief of Khe Sanh was celebrated as a victory. The base had held. The enemy had withdrawn. American firepower and marine determination had prevailed. But the celebration was muted by the realization of what the siege had cost, and questions about what it had accomplished. The casualty figures for Khe Sanh were debated then and remain somewhat uncertain today. Official Marine Corps records list 205 Marines killed in action and over 1,600 wounded at Khe Sanh Combat Base and its outposts during the siege. Additional casualties were suffered by Army, Air Force, and South Vietnamese forces. Aircraft losses included several dozen fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters destroyed or badly damaged. Enemy casualties were much harder to determine. Body counts were notoriously unreliable in Vietnam, often inflated for various reasons. The intensive bombing around Khe Sanh made accurate counts impossible in many cases. Estimates of North Vietnamese killed range from around 5,000 to over 15,000, with many more wounded. These were staggering losses, but whether they were worth it from the communist perspective depends on whether Khe Sanh achieved its purpose as a diversion for Tet. In the months following the relief, a strategic decision was made that shocked many of the Marines who had fought so hard to hold Khe Sanh. The base would be abandoned. The decision came from the highest levels of command. The reasoning was that Khe Sanh had served its purpose, that the strategic situation had changed, and that the base was too difficult and costly to maintain. The new American commander in Vietnam, General Creighton Abrams, who replaced Westmoreland, saw less value in holding remote static positions and preferred a more mobile strategy. In June and July of 1968, Khe Sanh was systematically dismantled. Equipment was removed. Bunkers were destroyed. The airstrip was abandoned. The Marines who had fought there watched with mixed feelings, as the base they had defended at such cost was reduced to rubble and then left behind. For many of them, it felt like their sacrifice had been for nothing. If the base was going to be abandoned anyway, why had they fought so hard to hold it? This question of whether Khe Sanh was worth it has been debated ever since. Military historians, veterans, and analysts have examined the siege from every angle, and consensus remains elusive. Let's look at the various perspectives. From a purely military standpoint, one could argue Khe Sanh was a success. The base held. The enemy suffered enormous casualties from the bombing campaign. American forces demonstrated they could withstand a sustained siege and employ firepower on a scale the enemy couldn't match. The Marine garrison showed exceptional courage and resilience. If the objective was to hold Khe Sanh, that objective was achieved. But was holding Khe Sanh the right objective? Critics argue that concentrating so many troops and resources on a remote base played into enemy hands. It fixed American forces in a location of the enemy's choosing. It consumed vast quantities of ammunition and supplies. It tied up air assets that could have been used elsewhere. And if Khe Sanh was indeed a diversion for Tet, then the Americans fell for the deception completely. Supporters counter that even if it was a diversion, successfully defending Khe Sanh denied the enemy a propaganda victory that would have had enormous impact. If Khe Sanh had fallen as Dien Bien Phu did, the psychological blow to American prestige and public support for the war would have been devastating. President Johnson might have been forced to negotiate from a position of weakness. So, holding Khe Sanh, regardless of enemy intentions, was necessary. There's also the question of what the siege accomplished in terms of enemy casualties. The bombing campaign around Khe Sanh inflicted heavy losses on North Vietnamese forces. Some analysts argue that several NVA divisions were rendered combat ineffective by the losses they sustained. If true, this would represent a significant military achievement that hampered enemy operations for months afterward. However, the North Vietnamese proved throughout the war that they were willing and able to absorb enormous casualties and continue fighting. So, the long-term impact is unclear. From the perspective of the Marines who fought there, Khe Sanh was about survival and doing their duty. They didn't make the strategic decisions that put them there or that eventually led to the base's abandonment. They were given a mission: hold this ground, and they held it. The fact that the base was later abandoned doesn't diminish their courage or sacrifice. They did what Marines have always done. They stood their ground against overwhelming odds and refused to break. The innovation in tactics and procedures that emerged from Khe Sanh had lasting value. The integration of air power, artillery, sensors, and intelligence that characterized Operation Niagara became a model for future operations. The tactics developed for resupplying under fire, for coordinating fire support, for defending against siege warfare in the modern era, all of these contributed to military doctrine going forward. The psychological impact on the North Vietnamese shouldn't be discounted either. They invested heavily in the Khe Sanh operation, committing multiple divisions and exposing them to unprecedented firepower. The losses they suffered demonstrated the cost of attempting major conventional operations against American forces with air superiority. This may have influenced subsequent North Vietnamese strategy, leading to a return to more guerrilla-style warfare until the final conventional offensive in 1975 when American forces had withdrawn. But perhaps the most important legacy of Khe Sanh is what it revealed about the nature of the Vietnam War and the limits of American military power. Khe Sanh showed that the United States could win tactical victories, could hold ground, could inflict casualties, and yet not be winning the war in any meaningful sense. The base was held at great cost, then abandoned. Enemy forces withdrew, but weren't defeated. They would regroup, replace their losses, and continue fighting. This pattern of inconclusive results, despite tactical success, was characteristic of much of the American experience in Vietnam. Winning battles didn't translate into winning the war, because the war wasn't really about holding territory. It was about political will, about which side could sustain the effort longer. The North Vietnamese were fighting for what they saw as national unification and independence, and they were prepared to accept casualties that would be unthinkable to American public opinion. The media coverage of Khe Sanh also had lasting impact. The siege was one of the most extensively reported battles of the war. Reporters lived through the siege with the Marines, and their dispatches brought the reality of combat into American homes. The images of young Marines huddled in bunkers, the endless artillery bombardments, the casualties, all of this affected public perception of the war. The fact that the base was later abandoned seemed to confirm critics' arguments that the war was pointless. For the Marines who served at Khe Sanh, the siege was a defining experience. Many struggled with the physical and psychological wounds they carried home. The Veterans Administration system was ill-equipped to deal with the number and nature of veterans' problems. Some Khe Sanh veterans thrived after the war, building successful lives and families. Others struggled with addiction, unemployment, PTSD, and the challenges of readjusting to civilian life after experiencing combat. Veterans of Khe Sanh formed associations and held reunions, gathering to remember fallen comrades and share experiences with others who understood what they'd been through. These gatherings served an important therapeutic function, allowing veterans to process their experiences and honor the memory of those who didn't make it home. The bonds formed under fire at Khe Sanh lasted lifetimes. The battlefield itself gradually returned to peace. The bunkers collapsed, trenches filled in, and jungle reclaimed the ground. The abandoned airstrip became overgrown. In later years, the area around Khe Sanh remained remote and underdeveloped. A small museum was eventually established near the old combat base, displaying artifacts from the battle and telling the story of the siege. Vietnamese visitors and some American veterans who returned could walk the ground and try to visualize what happened there. Some veterans who returned to Khe Sanh decades later found it a cathartic experience. Seeing the site at peace, without the sound of artillery or the threat of attack, helped them process their memories. Meeting Vietnamese people living normal lives in the area provided a sense of closure. The enemy soldiers they'd fought had also been young men doing their duty, and many of them hadn't survived either. The shared experience of war, even from opposite sides, created a strange bond. The strategic lessons of Khe Sanh were studied extensively by military professionals. The siege became a case study taught at staff colleges and war colleges. Future officers studied the decisions made at every level, from tactical dispositions to strategic concepts, analyzing what worked and what didn't. Some of the lessons were straightforward: the importance of air power, the value of well-prepared defensive positions, the necessity of maintaining supply lines. Others were more subtle and complex: the relationship between tactical success and strategic objectives, the role of media in modern warfare, the limits of firepower. The North Vietnamese also studied Khe Sanh and drew their own lessons. They learned that attempting major conventional operations against American forces with air superiority was costly and difficult. They refined their tactics for future engagements, placing greater emphasis on dispersal, camouflage, and operations during weather conditions that grounded American aircraft. They also understood that they didn't need to win tactical victories to achieve their strategic objectives. Simply staying in the fight, absorbing losses, and continuing to resist was enough to erode American public support for the war. In the broader narrative of the Vietnam War, Khe Sanh occupies a significant but somewhat ambiguous place. It wasn't the decisive battle that determined the war's outcome. It didn't directly lead to American withdrawal or North Vietnamese victory. But it was a dramatic episode that captured public attention, demonstrated the courage and resilience of American troops, and illustrated the fundamental difficulties of the entire war effort. The juxtaposition of Khe Sanh and Tet in early 1968 marked a turning point in the war. Militarily, American and South Vietnamese forces had defeated the Tet offensive, inflicting massive casualties on the Communists and holding all major positions. But politically and psychologically, the impact was devastating to American support for the war. The fact that the enemy could launch such a widespread offensive after years of being told the war was being won shattered credibility. President Johnson, already under pressure from the scale of Tet and the ongoing siege of Khe Sanh, announced at the end of March 1968 that he would not seek re-election. This stunning political development was directly related to the events in Vietnam. The siege of Khe Sanh, combined with Tet, had contributed to the erosion of public support that led to Johnson's decision. Whether this was the North Vietnamese intention or an unexpected bonus, the strategic impact was enormous. The relief of Khe Sanh in April removed one source of anxiety, but it didn't change the fundamental trajectory of American involvement in Vietnam. The war would continue for 7 more years, with escalating domestic opposition, gradual American withdrawal under the policy of Vietnamization, and ultimately communist victory in 1975. Khe Sanh was one chapter in a long, tragic story that ended in defeat for America's South Vietnamese allies. When we assess Khe Sanh today, more than 50 years later, we should remember several things. First, the courage of the men who fought there. Approximately 6,000 Marines and their allies endured 77 days of hell, living underground under constant fire, never knowing if this would be the day the human wave attacks would overwhelm them. They did their duty with honor, and their sacrifice deserves recognition regardless of strategic debates. Second, we should remember the innovation and adaptation that characterized the defense of Khe Sanh. The coordination of air power, artillery, and intelligence that made up Operation Niagara was unprecedented. The tactics developed for resupply under fire, for maintaining morale during extended siege, for integrating sensors and other technology into the defensive scheme, all of these represented genuine military innovation that had value beyond this one battle. Third, we should acknowledge the strategic and political complexities that made Khe Sanh controversial. The decision to hold the base, the massive resources devoted to its defense, and the subsequent decision to abandon it all raised legitimate questions about strategy and the conduct of the war. These questions don't have simple answers, but they're worth grappling with as we try to understand what happened and why. Fourth, we should remember the enemy's perspective. The North Vietnamese troops who besieged Khe Sanh also showed courage and determination. They endured the most intensive bombing campaign in history up to that time. They suffered staggering casualties. They fought for what they believed in, and from their perspective, they were fighting for independence and national unification. Understanding their perspective doesn't require agreeing with it, but it helps us see the full picture of what happened at Khe Sanh. Finally, we should consider what Khe Sanh tells us about war in general and the Vietnam War in particular. Military force, even overwhelming military force, has limits. Technology and firepower can dominate the battlefield, but can't necessarily achieve political objectives. Public support and political will are as important as tactical success. These are lessons that remain relevant today as we consider military interventions and counterinsurgencies around the world. The 77-day siege of Khe Sanh stands as one of the epic defensive battles in military history. It ranks alongside famous sieges like the Alamo, Bastogne, and the Battle of Britain as examples of outnumbered defenders holding against overwhelming odds. The Marines at Khe Sanh added another chapter to the long tradition of the Marine Corps, proving once again that Marines don't retreat, they don't surrender, and they don't lose. But Khe Sanh also stands as a symbol of the Vietnam War's complexities and frustrations. A battle won tactically, but ambiguous strategically. Ground held at great cost and then abandoned. Courage and sacrifice in service of a cause that ultimately failed. These contradictions don't diminish the courage of those who fought there, but they do remind us that in war, winning battles isn't always enough. For the families of the 205 Marines who died at Khe Sanh, the strategic debates are academic. They lost fathers, sons, brothers, husbands. No strategic analysis can bring them back or ease that loss. The same is true for the thousands of wounded who carry physical and psychological scars from the siege. And it's true for the North Vietnamese families who lost loved ones in the battle, though their losses are less well documented and less often remembered in America. The story of Khe Sanh is ultimately a human story. It's about young men, most barely out of their teens, thrust into a situation of extreme danger and stress. It's about how they coped, how they supported each other, and how they found the strength to keep going day after day. It's about leadership under pressure, from squad leaders to battalion commanders to the generals and admirals planning operations thousands of miles away. It's about the helicopter and transport plane crews who flew into danger repeatedly to resupply the base and evacuate casualties. It's about the fighter pilots and bomber crews who flew thousands of sorties, sometimes in terrible weather, to deliver ordnance on enemy positions. It's about the artillery crews who fired tens of thousands of rounds, the communicators who kept information flowing, the engineers who kept critical systems functioning under fire, and all the other specialists whose contributions were essential to the defense. It's about the medics and doctors who worked around the clock, treating horrific wounds with limited supplies, saving lives under conditions that would challenge the best civilian trauma centers. It's about the supply and logistics personnel who managed the complex task of keeping 6,000 troops fed, armed, and equipped when everything had to come in by air. It's about the intelligence analysts who tried to understand enemy intentions, the planners who developed the defensive schemes, and the decision-makers at every level who balanced competing priorities and made choices with life or death consequences. And it's about the American people watching from home, divided in their opinions about the war, but united in their concern for the troops at Khe Sanh. The siege captured the nation's attention in a way few battles did. People followed the news religiously, praying for the Marines' safety, debating the war's merits, and hoping for a positive outcome. When the siege ended, there was relief but not celebration. Too many questions remained unanswered. Was it worth it? What did we accomplish? Will it happen again somewhere else? These questions would continue to haunt the nation as the war dragged on for 7 more years. In the years since the war ended, our understanding of Khe Sanh has evolved. New documents have been released. Historians have had access to North Vietnamese sources. Veterans from both sides have shared their perspectives. This fuller picture confirms some earlier assessments and challenges others. The debate continues, which is healthy. History shouldn't be static. Each generation should examine the past and draw its own conclusions. What remains constant is respect for those who fought at Khe Sanh. Whatever we think about the war's justification or the strategic wisdom of defending the base, the courage and sacrifice of the men there deserves honor. They wrote a chapter in military history that will be remembered as long as people study warfare. They demonstrated qualities of courage, resilience, and brotherhood that represent the best of military service. The artillery duel at Khe Sanh, with thousands of rounds exchanged daily, with American firepower from land and air pounding enemy positions while North Vietnamese guns hammered the base, was warfare on a scale rarely seen before or since. The sheer volume of ordnance expended, the duration of the bombardment, and the intensity of the fighting all mark Khe Sanh as an exceptional battle. But numbers and statistics can't capture the human experience. They can't convey what it felt like to live in a bunker for 77 days, to lose friends, to wonder if you'd survive, to find reserves of courage you didn't know you had. They can't express the relief when the siege finally ended, the complicated feelings when the base was later abandoned, or the lifelong impact on those who were there. The Marines who defended Khe Sanh are aging now. In 1968, they were 19 or 20 years old. Now they're in their 70s, many of them grandfathers. Some have passed away. As the generation that fought in Vietnam gradually fades, it becomes more important than ever to preserve their stories, to remember what they went through, and to ensure that the lessons of Khe Sanh aren't forgotten. Those lessons are many, about the nature of siege warfare in the modern era, about the integration of air power and ground forces, about logistics and supply under fire, about the limits of firepower, about the importance of preparation and defensive engineering, about leadership and morale, about the relationship between tactical success and strategic objectives, about the role of media in war, about the complexities of limited war and counterinsurgency. These lessons remain relevant for military professionals and for citizens trying to understand when and how military force should be employed. But perhaps the most important lesson is simpler and more fundamental. War is hell. It demands more from human beings than almost anything else we can experience. It tests people to their limits and beyond. It creates bonds of brotherhood that last lifetimes. It inflicts wounds, physical and psychological, that never completely heal. It should be undertaken only when absolutely necessary, with clear objectives and with full understanding of the costs. Khe Sanh reminds us of these truths. The 77-day siege, the artillery duel that raged around the clock, the courage of the defenders, the losses suffered on both sides. All of this speaks to war's terrible reality. We honor those who fought there not by glorifying war, but by remembering what they endured, learning from their experience, and doing everything we can to ensure that war is our last resort, not our first. As we conclude this examination of the siege of Khe Sanh, we should take a moment to remember some of those who were there. The young private who died on the first day when the ammunition dump exploded, the sergeant who led counterattacks to restore the perimeter, the pilot who flew his final mission, bringing in supplies, the corpsman who worked until he collapsed from exhaustion, treating the wounded, the colonel who held the defense together through sheer force of will, and the thousands of others, named and unnamed, who stood their ground when it would have been understandable to break. We remember the North Vietnamese soldiers too, the ones who faced that awful American firepower, who attacked into machine gun fire and artillery barrages, who died by the thousands in the valleys and jungles around Khe Sanh. They were somebody's sons and brothers too. They believed they were fighting for a just cause, for their country's independence. War made them enemies, but it didn't make them any less human. The story of Khe Sanh is a tragedy in the classical sense. Brave men on both sides, fighting for what they believed in, causing enormous suffering, achieving ambiguous results. There are lessons to be learned, but there are no simple answers. The complexities of the Vietnam War are reflected and concentrated in those 77 days at Khe Sanh. May we never forget what happened there. May we honor those who fought there. May we learn from their experience. And may we strive to resolve our conflicts without requiring such courage and sacrifice from our young people. That would be the best tribute we could offer to the defenders of Khe Sanh and to all who have served in war. The siege ended in April of 1968. The base was abandoned a few months later. The war continued for 7 more years. But Khe Sanh remains in memory and in history as a testament to courage, a study in strategy, and a reminder of war's enduring reality. As long as we study military history, as long as we remember those who served, the story of the 77-day siege of Khe Sanh Fire Support Base will be told. And it should be, because their story deserves to be remembered, and we need to remember it.